As the sun began to set on the picturesque county village of Stowe, Northamptonshire, and the fields glowed in burnt orange, the stillness of the night was interrupted by the sound of metal on metal, crunching and echoing into the night. It was around 6:30 p.m. and 57-year-old Dennis Quinn was coming to the end of his long journey home from Goslow, where he had spent the week working as an IT troubleshooter. As he disembarked the grueling M6 motorway, he felt a heaviness fall upon his eyes, but decided against resting as he was only 15 minutes from home. This turned out to be the worst decision of his life. As he made his way through the narrow country lanes, his concentration began to waver, and before he knew anything about it, he awoke to the beeping sound of heart monitors and paramedics rushing around trying to stick him with needles, and the panic setting in due to the constraint of the oxygen mask covering his face. It became apparent to him that he had fallen asleep at the wheel. However, he did not understand how he came to be here in this ambulance. Once at Northampton General Hospital, it was explained to him that he had been in a serious accident with an articulated vehicle and had been extremely lucky that the emergency services were able to cut him free from his vehicle. Dennis had suffered various broken bones, leg injuries so severe that one had to be amputated below the knee, and head trauma so vicious that he was put into an induced coma, which turned out to be an experience he would rather not have been put through. 3 weeks had now passed, and Dennis's brain trauma had only deteriorated, and the doctors feared that if they brought him out of his coma right now, his psychological health could take a serious decline. As the days and weeks passed, Dennis began to have experiences that were inexplicable. The nurses noticed slight muscular movements that should not be possible in his current state. Also, strange cuts and bruises began to appear all over his body, although no one but his designated medical staff had entered his private room. 6 months had now passed since the horrific accident had changed Dennis's life forever, and on January 15, 2006, he was brought out of his coma and began to regain a small notion of reality, although very short-lived. The nights passed slowly, and the nightmares became more intense as he relived every distressing moment of the last 6 months. His daughter, Beverly, was the only person he could explain to and confide in about what had happened, and so it began. Firstly, Dennis began to describe the reality of his nightmares during his comatose existence. It was as though I was being used for experimentation, held against my will, and every time I began to close my eyes, they were forced back open, depriving me of sleep for days at a time. He continued to explain the things he felt during this time. I could feel sharp stabbing pains in the corners of my eyes, and it was syringes draining my tear ducts. I can see the piercing gray eyes above the surgeon's masks, and I could see how much they were enjoying the pain they put me through. Tears began to roll down the cheeks of the 30-year-old brunette as the details of his horror began to register. The next 2 days were relaxed, no mention of what had happened, and it seemed as though the worst was over. How wrong she was. For the next day, Dennis began to relive the next part of his torment. Next came the torture of the razor blades and the burns. They would strap me down on the bed and place a leather strap in my mouth to stifle the screams, he described. This was the most unbearable. They sliced delicately through the skin on the soles of my feet, he continued, unaware at this point of the amputation. The pain was excruciating. They cut the joints under and between my toes, just enough to break the skin before dousing them in salt. He winced as he recollected the feeling. Then came the stubbing of the cigarettes on my various body parts. The favorite area was my groin and inner thighs, as these are the least noticeable areas. But still, there was no explanations for the appearance of the cuts and bruises on his body, and after looking further, it was noticed that Dennis had the remains of savage burns in the areas he had described. He went on to try and explain how these markings had appeared, even though in reality no actual torture had occurred. Then 2 of my captors brandished hunting knives and proceeded to dissect portions of my forearms and calves to expose bare muscle and tendons. I passed out due to the pain, but they waited until I came round in order to continue my mutilation. Next was my stomach and thighs, careful not to cut too deep to allow me to live, but just enough to ensure my full cooperation in what they desired, even though I had no idea what that was or who exactly they thought I was. All Beverly could do was sit, listen, and watch as her father became more and more distressed by what he was saying. The doctors suggested sedation, but judging by what he had already experienced, this was a definite non-starter. She didn't want him to go through more torment. She sat by his bed night after night, and as the nightmares came, she held his hand and comforted him, saying, "It's okay, Dad, I'm here, don't worry, I won't let them hurt you." Finally came the account of how the bruising arrived. After all the torment he had been through, he recalled the beatings he received. Also, it was revealed as to who they thought he was and why he was there. Firstly, it was just torrents of slaps and punches before escalating to things like bats and hammers to the fingers. They broke all my fingers one at a time by hitting them with a hammer, he described. All I could do was scream, "What do you want from me?"
"Your soul,"
was the answer. But I had no intention of giving up the only thing that made me human and separated me from them. I had to be strong. I had to make it through for you. I couldn't and wouldn't leave you alone in this vile world. 6 weeks later, Dennis was released and underwent both physiotherapy and psychotherapy in order to help with his ordeal. It is a long process, but Dennis is making a slow but full recovery.